Passion for sailing. I've had it all my life really, since being a baby. I have two brothers and my father always went ocean racing and sailed. As a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, I used to look up to Dad as a hero who did the Hobart race and followed the Hobart race very closely on the radio, on the television. And we built model boats of famous boats at the time, Ragamuffin and Kealoha, and go out on the local river here just down the harbour and row around behind these boats and have mini Hobart races and handicap results and all this sort of thing as young kids, and it grew on from there.
Edward was always, I've got photos of Edward, he's always holding a boat as a little boy. He was always into boats, and Arthur tagged along.
In 1979 was my first Hobart with my father on a boat called Meltemi, which was a Sparkman Stevens 45-footer. It was pretty scary, that first race. I was only 18 years old and I'd heard all these horror stories about Bass Strait, and so it was a fairly difficult thing to do. I was very excited about it, but also apprehensive about whether I could handle it, and etc. Having Dad there was great. He's a good seaman. I'm his son, so I'm biased, but others say that he's a very good seaman as well. So it was good to have him there to show me the way. What's understated a lot in the Hobart race is the power of teamwork. A good team in a race and any endurance type event, teamwork when you're getting tired can really assist in making you a more powerful force. When you're out in a blow on a small boat and there's a big sea, and the best guy to have sitting next to you is Bob Thomas.
Keep it up, Alexander!
Arthur, my brother, is more of a manager in many ways than me. He understands that it's a 4-day race and you need to manage your resources evenly over those 4 days. John Whitfield, my forward hand, I reckon he's the best small boat forward hand in Australia. Michael Benzic, Mix, was one of the guys that was making model boats with us when we were 6 years old and has shared the dream of doing a Hobart together. Chris Rockall, just a tough guy that you know is going to do what has to be done. Gordo, I think, brought to the boat a sense of humour, which is very important in this sort of team sport where you're under pressure and things are getting tough. But he was respected, he was part of the crew. We were just 7 people that were all treated as equals.
There she is, Lockie has had a collision now. She was on port there. I don't know which tack the shot on, and here it is. David Whitshot. And that's Huey Trahan that she's collided with. Hugh Trahan, Bright Morning Star. Terribly sad situation there. Nokia and Bright Morning Star in a collision at the start.
My feeling is that rock stars, while they're fantastic sailors, potentially don't create the same deep teamwork that we've tried to develop. If there's someone who wants to sail with us who is a rock star and he does his time, then sure, he may get on if he fits into the crew, but there's none of this chopping people out at the last minute and bringing in someone who's outstanding.
There's an overwhelming belief that we can be as fast as some of the guys on some of these very expensive boats with very highly paid crews. We know our strengths, our weaknesses, how we can support one another as best we can. At the end of the day, this is a team sport, and we've done the hard yards together.
For us, it was a new boat as well. This was our first serious race, and we'd had it barely a month, and we were learning a bit as we went because we'd never had the boat in this sort of conditions. We knew that we were on the pace with the other boats there. There were certain elements of calculated risk, but we were going so well. We felt that we had, the boat in our control. It was just too good an opportunity to give up. It was the fastest I've ever been on a boat. We were doing over 20 knots. It's like being on a hydrofoil or something. Just the bow is permanently just spraying water out that's running down past the back of the stern of the boat. And the seas are building, so the evening of the first day out, as we were approaching the impending low that was coming up from the south, the winds were getting faster and faster. And it was quite a surreal experience because it was pitch black night, there was thunderstorms with lightning everywhere, and we were just smoking.
8 o'clock on the on Boxing Day, we have our first sked. It basically reinforced what I'd been told by the Bureau of Meteorology, that the next day was not going to be pretty, that we would have a prefrontal trough or a little front that night, and then the next day, sometime after lunchtime, we would be getting into the main storm.
The front sort of came very quickly when it arrived. You could see the dark clouds
formulating in the distance, and within the space of 20 to 40 minutes the breeze had picked up from 10 to 15 knots to 20, 30, 40 knots going up through the wind ranges.
I was watching the readout, the digital readout, and it was saying 25 knots, 30 knots, 35 knots, 40 knots, 45 knots, 50 knots, and then the screen, the digital readout went blank. I thought, that doesn't, it goes up to well over 100, so it shouldn't just go blank. So I've looked up the top of the mast, and the wind has blown the titanium fitting off the top of the mast, the wind meter, and that thing is riveted to the top of the mast. So at that point, we knew we were in extremely dangerous, life-threatening conditions.
All of us were quite scared of the conditions. In fact, a lot of us were. I would be coming off watch, for example, and I'd be sitting down, still in my wet weather gear, completely saturated, and I just couldn't stop shaking. I think it was like that we were all sort of trying to cope with our situations and our fears. And I think that looking around the person next to you, you know that they were actually privately going through those fears, but also by sort of congratulating someone and just geeing them up, the small things made a lot of difference, that we're all in this together, and that no matter what effort you put in, you knew it was 100%.
The general condition on deck was extremely uncomfortable and quite terrifying. It was, I think anybody who said that they weren't genuinely afraid would be lying.
The air was full of water, so you had conditions that meant that the tops of waves were literally being blown off by the breeze and into the air. It was cutting into you. It would physically hurt. That's how hard the droplets of water were being blown through the air.
The most terrifying thing was the wind. If you take an old-fashioned kettle, and when it gets to a boiling point, that high-pitched scream was almost identical to the noise that this wind made, and it was never stopped. You couldn't talk to anybody on deck. You couldn't get any verbal communication. Just wasn't happening unless you were yelling in someone's ear right next to you.
We had two bad knockdowns, and the worst one was where I pulled away a bit early at the top. The wave hadn't quite come through yet, and we were caught on the lip of the wave and thrown back down as the wave crashed over us.
Mix and I were downstairs below decks, and we were just about to go back on watch, I think. And Mix had done the wise thing, and he was sitting down, pulling his trousers on. And so it's not a very big boat, didn't leave a lot of room on the floor, so I was standing up, trying to put my trousers on. And at that point, just as I was sort of standing on one leg, the boat fell off a wave, and there was nothing holding me on the floor, so I floated through the air with as much dignity as I could muster and cracked my head on one of the bolts that was holding fittings on the deck.
The force of the wave, I just couldn't hang on. It just took me away. There was no way you could hang on. And I was washed back to a stainless steel life railing, and I hit that with my ribs. It was about 6 feet from where my life harness took up, so it took up at the same time as I hit the rail. I didn't break my ribs, but I certainly bruised them badly.
There was a very loud crack when I hit my head, and I wasn't sure whether the crack was caused by the boat giving a little bit or by my skull giving a little bit, so I was pretty intent on finding out which piece was which. So I was nervous to touch it because I wondered if I was going to touch hard or squishy. So I started asking guys around me, how bad do you think this looks?
Luckily, the stainless steel railing didn't break, so I was actually inside the boat. But the boat was lying on its side with water everywhere, so I was not quite inside the boat, if you know what I mean. The boat stopped with that. It was any speed it had was taken away with that wave. And the problem we had was that there were big sets of waves coming through, and I knew that there'd be another big one coming through pretty soon, and if we didn't get moving, we'd be just a sitting duck. It's what we tried to avoid all the time was being a sitting duck in the water waiting for a wave to come and take us out. So I was able to crawl back to the helm, to the tiller, in enough time to get the boat pointed in the right direction, to get the sail that we had up filled with wind, to get movement again, and we had about 5-6 knots of manoeuvrability before the next wave came through. We got over the top and kept going. But certainly that was a scary one. That was one time when I thought, you know, this is it. We've really gone too far this time.
It's one of the agreements that Ed and I came to after I managed to convince him not to pull out of the race was that I should at least stay below for a period of time while we just evaluated whether I was concussed, how badly concussed, that kind of thing. The last thing you want is a guy with concussion wandering around in those conditions up on deck. So, yeah, I stayed downstairs and stayed in my bunk, but I made sure that I stayed in the bunk that was on the side of the boat that I could do the most, or be of the most benefit, where my weight was the most benefit.
Down below was like another world. It had its own fears and problems. What you're trying to avoid in those conditions is the boat flying up the face of a wave and then just launching off the top of the wave, because it becomes airborne and then falls into the trough of the next wave. But if you then have a 60-foot mast that falls 30 feet and it turns into a pile driver and just knocks the keel out of the boat, and then the boat sinks. It sinks in a matter of seconds. So the people down below are waiting. As the boat launches off a wave, they've already been told, big wave, hold on. So you're bracing yourself for the impact. Boat launches, and then there's this silence, and then there's a deafening crashing noise as the hull hits the water and just reverberates, and it vibrates. It's like you're inside a metal drum. We probably did that about 6 times, and that's 6 times too many.
In some respects, it's more comfortable to be sitting up on the rail, even though it sounds perverse, but even though it's wet and it's windy and it's horrible, being down below, it's a whole different experience, and it's a somewhat claustrophobic experience, and also you have no sense of what's going on around you.
The radio was going, and so I could hear the Mayday calls start. Been starting for a little while, 15 years I guess, and that was the first genuine Mayday call that I'd ever heard in all that time. And then I heard another, and then I heard another, and I started thinking, we're in the cactus here.
Stand aside, Honeyman 1. Roger, 2 things. Do you have a motor? Motor is not working, over.
When we actually arrived on scene, the rain was pelting in, the skies were black, the waves were enormous, the wind was buffeting the helicopter. So we were, both of us, vomiting quite, well, a lot before we even started our winching. At any given point, we can say, look, I'm sorry, this situation is too dangerous for us to attempt to do. But if we leave these men here, they're going to die, and it puts you in a very precarious situation. It's like, well, what do? You know, you want to look after yourself, but there was still 4 men down there that you knew if you didn't try and get them out, they would die. And so it just became a point of, okay, well, we're going to do this, and hopefully we can do it well and we can rescue them.
We hadn't heard where Ed's boat was for quite some time, probably a period of 24 hours, close to that we didn't really know where they were, but no news is good news. And we were hearing other things that weren't, that were quite distressing about the other boats that had to turn around and capsized and sinking and people being saved.
When it came to doing the task, you forgot about how sick you were and how scared you were, and you just physically did the job. Because the waves were so huge, one minute you'd be sort of buried way underneath the water, and the next minute you'd be sort of like rocketed out at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And then there was one gentleman that was actually floating off in the water, so he became the priority person to winch because he wasn't attached to anything. As you're being winched up, I was constantly talking to him saying, look, you're doing really well, this is what's going to happen, please do not lift your arms, please just stay as you are. And then as you go past the skids, the crewman grabs hold of you and pulls you in the door.
It was shocking, it was frightening and nerve-wracking. Most of us have children, and thinking just please get there, please be safe.
we got to Malakuta and we were letting the 4 guys out that we'd rescued, and the police and everyone came up and started offering the blankets to Michelle and I, saying, oh, you know, here you go. And we're like, oh no, you better give it to the guys we've just rescued. And they were like, oh my God, what? You mean you're not the ones that were rescued? And we're like, no, it was these gentlemen here. And so I think it surprised a lot of people, because they thought that, well, I guess they assumed that because we were girls, we were the ones that were rescued and not the ones doing the rescuing.
The Mayday call that I remember that had most effect on me was when I heard Winston Churchill come across. And they came across with the Mayday call first up, saying that they had some damage to the boat. They couldn't really establish what had caused the damage, but they had a lot of water coming in, and they felt they were in serious trouble, and they called the Mayday. In a short time after that, they called the Mayday down. They said, look, we've got the engine started, we've got pumps going, we think we're okay. And so I was thinking, well, that's kind of neat, good on them. And then 5 or 10 minutes again after that, they called back in again and said, look, we can't get, the pumps have stopped, the engine stopped, water in the engine or something. So we are calling Mayday, and in fact we are leaving the boat in the life rafts.
You know, I thought with our eldest daughter, she was only about 14 months old, and the feeling I was having at this really low point was it was like I just didn't have a chance to have an impact on her life, and it was like a waste. Like, you know, I felt angry. I felt if only I'd had a chance, which we bounced out of that position pretty quickly, you know, because that was not a place you wanted to be in. Because it just wasn't effective.
Conditions had got to a point where Bob wanted to make sure that we were prepared in case we did have to leave the boat.
What I did with the crew, because I'm a professional mariner, had been trained to some degree in lifeboat drills and just sea safety generally, is I just sat with the crew below, and then later the couple of guys that were in the cockpit on watch, just the way to do a life raft. You don't just throw a life raft off the side of the boat, inflate it, and everything is going to happen for you. It doesn't work that way. So basically people were assigned to do certain jobs, and someone assigned to get the life raft on deck, another one to grab the panic pack, which holds our flares, EPIRB, the essentials that should be in that life raft. And then we chatted about other things, water bottles, torches, throw all this stuff in if we can, if we have the time. But the main thing was just to not panic about it. If we have to go to a life raft, it's got to be a very controlled procedure so that we all get into the life raft. Otherwise, 2-3 guys get in it, they're blown away, and the rest of us are stuck in a sinking boat.
Dusk was coming on, and I was at the end of my tether and thinking to myself, while not telling the crew, if this continues, I can't keep going like this. And there's no one else that can steer this damn boat, so we're in serious trouble.
I remember climbing up there, you know, pull the hatch back, climb up into this maelstrom, and it was getting worse at this time. And I said, Ed, you've got to have a break. You've got to get down below.
Of course he was right, and I got off the helm and let him have a go, and he sailed superbly. If Arthur hadn't come to the fore and said, I can do this, that we mightn't have got through. So very important that he came up at that time and in the nicest possible way told me to get down below and let him have a go.
When the storm was at its worst, we tended to focus on short-term goals. We basically did not focus on what the end result was in terms of getting through the gale. We focused on the conditions and the circumstances at that particular time. By focusing on the short term, we could actually see ourselves working towards a specific goal, and that was actually to make sure the little things on the boat were working well. You know, the crew changes were rotating properly. We're giving enough water and support up to the helmsman at the time. It was just the small things to make sure that, you know, the maintenance of the boat and the maintenance of ourselves were the top priority.
Towards the end, it was at the end, in fact, of the bad 10 hours. We were in bunks down below, and these bunks, it's a racing boat, so they're almost like coffins, not a good word to use, but like coffins down below, racks against the side of the boat, and you're only 6 inches below the guy above you. with heads right here, so you can hear the other guy moving around, and you're very, very close to him. And Arthur suddenly said, we weren't sleeping, it was too hard to sleep, but Arthur suddenly said, listen to that. And I said, listen to what? Listen to what? My first reaction was, something's broken, he's heard something break. And gear failure in that condition could potentially mean fatality. So I immediately thought, oh no, here we go, it's about to happen. Listen to what? And he said, no, listen to that. And he was very emotional. He was, if not in tears, he was close to tears. You could tell he was choked up, just his voice was so full of emotion. And he said, you can hear Bob, who was steering at the time, you can hear Bob up in the cockpit, you can hear him talk. And the noise that I spoke about before, where you couldn't hear a thing, if you were right next to someone you couldn't hear anything, you can now hear the guy up in the cockpit giving orders, and you could hear the world again. And what it meant, of course, was that we got through the worst of this horrible storm that we were in.
It was the afternoon skid on December 28th, and we were down the northern coast of Tasmania. And I did my normal 1400 skid and got the position of all the boats that they could round up, whether they were racing or not. And what had evolved in the last 12 hours, we were by a very large margin winning the race at that point.
But there are occasions when Bob will act as somewhat of a counterweight to Ed's aggressiveness, if you like. And so there are, on the odd occasion, Bob will just consult with Ed about maybe making some sort of change that just takes a little bit off the boat, but means that, you know, we may have a bit of extra. Number one, we may have some flexibility to do something slightly different, or number two, it means that we may just have a bit more stamina if conditions, you know, do get a bit tougher then.
I came on deck, Ed and the crew were there. We were sailing with a full main. The weather was getting, it was fairly marginal. We were a little bit overpowered, and I said to Ed, we're in a bit of a hammer position here, and if we can stay in one piece, we should be able to win this race. And I said, I think we could probably use a reef in the main now.
About 2 miles from the finish, we'd been tacking 1,000 times against the current. The breeze had died out. We died 1,000 deaths of the breeze is going to go and we're going to lose the race, because in many races before, we and other boats had been caught on the Derwent for 8 hours without breeze, and all chance of winning taken away with that. So that was certainly a concern, but we did get through it. We had about 2 miles to go to the finish.
And I said to Ed, Ed, you know, we've tried, our father's raced in this race for years, and we've tried to have a crack at it for many years, and you know, I think we're going to make it. I think we're going to do it. And there was no response. I thought, this is a bit strange, and I was a bit choked up, so I thought, well, I won't say anything. It mustn't be a big issue for Ed. So I didn't think anything else of it, and still trimming away at the main. And about 45 seconds later, this big hand just lands on your shoulder, and that was it.
My brother had a cell phone, and he had either rung my father or my father had rung him, and it was shoved in my face. Arthur said, listen, Dad wants to talk to you, quick, talk to your father.
Oh, I think I started to cry, which is a bit unusual. And I said, I'm glad you've made it, Ed.
In first place, overall, in the 1998 Telstra 54th Sydney to Hobart Yacht Race, AFR Midnight Rambler, owned by Ed Saltis and Bob Thomas from the CYCA, is the smallest boat in 10 years to have won the Sydney to Hobart race.
We just finished the race at 6 minutes past 5. We were motoring into the dock, very tired, still coming to grips with what had happened, emotionally drained from the rigours of the Derwent and which way do we go, and tactical arguments we were having about which way we should go. So there was a bit of tension amongst the crew, even after we finished the race. And there was some woman over on the docks yelling in the dusk, yelling out, "Go the Rambler, go the Rambler," shaking her hands and I think it was me that said, "We don't need this right now." and Arthur said, "Ed, I think it's your wife, so you better start listening."
When we went across the finishing line, and there was something like 12, 14 boats, big boats had finished, and we were the next boat, and our mast was like about half the size of anybody else's mast, and the guys on the maxis and the yacht administrators were saying, oh, go in here, go in next to the big boats. And I can remember the crew talking around it and sort of having a vote around what we should do, but we agreed that no, it's traditional to go into Constitution Dock because our father had gone in there, and that this is a very symbolic thing that we have to do, a spiritual thing that we've got to do.
When we finally moored up, we all got off the boat, and Sue came up to me and gave me a hit in the stomach. And I said, what was that for? And she said, that's from Anne, my wife. And she said, because Anne said to give that to you for putting her through all the heartache and tension that she had to put up with for the last 2 or 3 days.
Shipwright Arms I've been going to ever since 1979, my first race, when I was 18. Only just allowed to drink. I went to the back bar of the Shipwright Arms and saw these yachting photos around the wall, and all the greats go there for a drink. All the yachting heroes of the Hobart go to this one pub for a drink or 10 after the race. That night, on the night of the 30th, we went to the Shipwright Arms, walked in as we normally do, the crew.
And the whole place stood up and clapped them, and oh, it was magical, a magical moment. And you could just see all the crew, people knew that they had won, and it was an acknowledgement. And they were beaming. It was lovely.
I've been through a lot of storms with Ed, a lot of experiences with him. And I think sitting on the side of the boat wave spotting while he was helming in those sort of conditions was something that really made me feel quite proud. I felt that you know, here's a person that I've got my life completely in his hands. He was performing extraordinary feats of strength and seamanship to hold a 35-foot boat on the right course in those conditions was something extraordinary. I felt that he was giving more than 110% at every case.
The way that I made sense, I guess, of what was going on around us was that I thought to myself, well, we as a crew are pretty good at what we do. We've all been doing it for a little while. We are all doing what we all agree is the best thing that we can do right now to make sure we get through this.
You know, one of the things that it really taught me was just how critical it is to have, you know, other people buy into what you're doing, and to, you know, set a goal that everyone has bought into achieving.
If we can't do and can't think of anything that we can do that's any better than this, and we still lose, then we've given it our best shot, and there was no lost opportunities, and there was nothing else, nothing better that we could have done that we could think of. And so that kind of freed me up to be quite philosophical about that and get on to doing the things that could actually help us.
It's paid dividends for me just in terms of my professional life as well. So, you know, it's really, like, that race just really did change the way I looked at my work in particular. And, you know, it's something that I will always sort of think back on if ever I'm facing a challenge on that front.
The overriding issue that came out of the Hobart race, I think, is teamwork. First thing that came into my mind when someone said, others have failed, others have died, boats have been lost, you got through this, how did you do it? The first thing I said was teamwork. It was teamwork that did this for us. We wouldn't have got through if we didn't have the strong team that we had. And I didn't make a speech and it all suddenly happened. It evolved over potentially 10 years of gradual learning lessons and failing, then succeeding, then failing, and different characters coming together and learning about how each other worked together, strengths and weaknesses. And that created a very, very strong force that came to the fore in '98, and probably only really came to the fore when we were right on the edge, when you were pushed to the edge and you were forced to rely on whatever you could hang on to. This teamwork thing suddenly emerged. I mean, it was always there, but it without anyone saying now's the time, it just happened. After the '98 race, we were very close to saying, well, that's great, we've achieved our Mount Everest and it's time to go and do something else, but that wasn't going to happen, I'm afraid. And I'm still, not just me, but the whole crew, and I think you may have seen this in some of the other interviews you've had, that the whole crew is still passionate about this Sydney Hobart yacht race. We still enjoy doing it, we still enjoy getting out there, and there's nothing that I'd like to have more than to win the race overall. Again, not many people have done it twice, so that'd be something, and I'm still young enough, so I'll be out there for the next 10-15 years giving it a go.